Are sexual orientation and gender able to be determined by genetics? Do all men and women of science reject the transgender narrative? If they don't, is it because they hate transgender people or are trying to erase them? These are some of the questions that we are going to hear Dr. Richard Dawkins weigh in on, and we're going to give some of our own thoughts ourselves. I wonder if you expected to hear a self-proclaimed biblical creationist reference an evolutionary biologist, but here on this channel, we are all about truth, and we are all about a conversation around our entire community and around our society, and asking ourselves, does truth supersede cultural moments and cultural discussions? So, welcome to The Crossing with Tomi. Here we discuss where biblical and cultural thinking differ, and we apply the Bible to everyday life so you can think biblically, if you want to. Often as Christians, it is assumed that we only give serious study to the Bible and ignore any other forms of study or truth. Another assumption I hear often is that we are generally either unaware or willfully reject other forms of study or other methods of finding absolute truth. Although, if you can't tell by my tone, I do find this pretty funny. The reality is, I understand the sentiment because before I came to know the Lord, I also thought that to be a Christian, you had to check your brain at the door and no longer have critical or rational thinking. Not only is this a very common assumption, but it has some pretty interesting cultural impact. If you think about it, intelligent design or accepting any other worldview beyond that of evolutionary Darwinism is taught as a fairy tale or a really big fallacy in public school. I mean, imagine you're taught for 12 years that if you believe in the concept of intelligent design or attribute that intelligent design to a specific designer, then you are denying reality and facts. It doesn't really make the mind wonder about how one would come to the conclusion or the presupposition that Christians just aren't logical or aren't based in reason or science. And if you were to go so far as to defend your thought, you would be labeled as an unintelligent fool, a useful idiot, contributing, as Dawkins would say, only to a positive culture and society and intellectually nothing else. I am, of course, referencing when Dawkins said a few months ago in relation to immigration in his country of England that he appreciates a Christian society, or I should say a culturally Christian society, and acknowledges the social and economic benefits that this Christian society has afforded not only England but also the world, noting that those who follow Christ, or at least who culturally follow Christian ideals, have laid a very functional foundation for Western society. So funny enough, I actually filmed a video on that a few months ago, but life just kind of got a hold of me and I never actually published that video. So if you guys have interest in me weighing in on Dawkins' commentary around some of the cultural shifts in his country and a call for people to remain culturally Christian, definitely let me know in the comments and I will work on editing that for you. But today we are going to talk about something else. Namely, we are going to focus on Dawkins' responses to some questions that also commonly get laid at Christians' feet. As we get into this question and answer session, I will go ahead and say that as much as I respect Dr. Dawkins and the work that he has done in his life and some of the accurate conclusions he has been able to make given his studies, a lot of my issue that I take with him and his general approach is that he speaks in absolutes when there isn't an absolute, or he makes a strong assertion without properly and completely acknowledging that it is an incomplete assertion that he's making. He's basically often saying, well, if you assume this is true, then logically that is true, and therefore I hold that that is true. And I know I'm kind of being vague here, but we will see one example of this in this next part that we get into, where he's asked to make a very specific determination. I find it interesting that Dawkins leads with the correct call out that it's difficult to actually get a definitive answer on this question of orientation having some sort of genetic contributing factor. He gives an explanation as to why and then seems to offer some sort of conclusion as though he's just made a definitive case or actually made a point. And I just don't really feel like that point lands. So there's a little disconnect for me there in his logic, or at least following his logic. Because it seems like he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He's saying either it is difficult to pin down and we can't really know the answer unless we could study it very specifically, or he's saying, no, it is definitive and we can absolutely study it and make these determinations. And in my mind, it has to be one or the other. But I guess that is kind of the process of a question of science that you don't have answered yet and is still being studied. But I wanted to offer that as a little bit of a kind of like bias watch out, or just like a don't take everything that he says as a complete foundational statement, because I think even as he's answering, he is stating that he doesn't really know because science doesn't really know yet. So take that for what it's worth.
Marcos wants to know on X how genes related to the sexual orientations, how genes relate to sexual orientations and gender.
Sexual orientation, I take that means homosexual, heterosexual, that kind of thing.
Right.
It's difficult to investigate these things. One of the ways to do it is twin studies, where you look at, if you have a pair of identical twins and if one of them is gay, is there a strong tendency for the other one to be gay? And the answer is yes. If you compare that with fraternal twins, with non-identical twins who share only half the genes as opposed to all of them of the relevant ones. So yes, there is a genetic component to sexual orientation, and that I believe is established. It doesn't mean it's inevitable, but that there is a strong strong genetic component to the variation.
Very interesting. I'm reading The Nurture Assumption right now. I don't know if that's a book that you've come across.
Remind me of the author.
Oh goodness, I'd have to go run into my room and find it. It's a female out of the East Coast. Steven Pinker wrote the introduction book.
Right.
Out in the 1990s, but then she did a follow-up with some more advanced studies where she essentially just says parenting doesn't matter nearly as much as you think it does.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with that. Yes, that's very interesting, very surprising. The idea that peers are much more influential.
Yes.
Than parents. It's rather disconcerting to anybody, to a parent, I suppose. And Steven Pinker is very big on that. Yes, it's interesting.
I asked my mother, I said, because I'm very different from my parents, I said, what percentage of me do you think came from your parenting versus my genes versus my peers? And she actually said, your peers seem to shape you the most in terms of who you became as an adult. So that's one anecdotal experience, but fascinating.
What I really find interesting here is his assistant seems to intuitively understand, even in this moment, that what he just said doesn't really line up with common sense or even basic logic. Because her mind immediately goes to a book that she's reading discussing the difference of the impact of nature versus nurture on the raising of a child. And when it comes to that child's specific outcome, what that child is exposed to impacts how that child will turn out. And I just find it incredibly interesting that Dawkins responds here with some sort of like surprise at the idea that the exposure to your peer group or exposure to outside influences have such a great impact on how a child develops. In fact, over and over again, there is evidence and anecdotal evidence for the fact that outside influences, or should I say more consistent outside influences, have more of an impact even often than the actual parental influence does. These outside influences, just like the parents might try to do, shape how a child sees themselves, how they develop their worldview, how they interpret the world around them, and what they value as important, especially as it comes to understanding foundations and the concept of reality. You don't need to be an evolutionary biologist or an atheist apologist to understand a rather simple thing, actually, but rather be something as simple as a mother raising children or have ever been a child growing up in the world to understand that outside influences have a very strong impact on the way that we end up seeing the world around us, especially in the formative years of early development, but also in the incredibly formative years of teenage and young adulthood. I mean, we can see this over the course of recent history, the impact of ideas on teenage girls, especially like various groups of phenomena such as anorexia in the early 90s. In Venezuela, it was exorcisms in the 2000s. We see it in fashion, in trends, in language, even to some of the widely spread gender ideology today. Ideas and outside influences greatly impact a person's worldview. This is simply a common sense case that many parents wish would be heard when it comes to parents wanting to have an understanding of the things that are being suggested to their children with or without knowledge. Ideas have consequences. And this very simple conglomeration of outside influences and ideas having consequences is one of the many cited reasons that many people choose to homeschool their children. While I understand the function of science and I understand the desire to take an idea or take an assumption or take a question and try to prove it, some things are truly just common sense, and you can observe them from living life and being a person of the world. And there's no amount of definitive study that is going to entirely shape how you do things, because you get up every day and you live your everyday life. And so being willing to have common sense as well as book intelligence and critical thinking are all factors in not only your worldview, but how you approach the world entirely. And as we get into the next question, I want to point out the accurate way that Dawkins notes that the attempt to change language does not change objective reality, which is, of course, many biblical Christians' stance on this and many other topics as well.
Okay, the next question from Angie. Why do you, a man of science, deny the reality that trans people exist? Why do you feel the need to hate a minority group that only wants to live their life as their true self and be left alone?
That's a ridiculous question. I don't deny their existence, and I don't in any way oppress them. What I object to is the statement, a woman can have a penis. A trans woman is a woman. I object to that because that's a distortion of language and a distortion of science. But as to saying they don't exist, that's absurd. Of course they exist. And there's no reason why they shouldn't exist.
Right. And I find that it's so easy in these conversations nowadays because language has been co-opted in such a way where you can't actually say something as it is without being accused of, denying that someone exists.
Well, exactly. Yes. I mean, to go from saying that a trans woman is not a woman as a scientific fact to saying you think they don't exist, meaning they don't live and they shouldn't live, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm fed up with that kind of distortion.
Or to assume that what you're saying is somehow hateful. That too, right?
Well, quite. I mean, that's totally ridiculous. It's simply a scientific fact that sex is determined in a biological way, which I could go into, but probably won't. And the fact that people have a psychological feeling that they're born into the wrong body, that's a psychological fact, which I think is probably true. And I have great sympathy with such people.
It is also a great conclusion to state that we are not trying to be hateful, nor trying to erase a person by speaking the truth about biology, but rather it is the emotion-led narrative that seeks not to operate in objective reality and chooses to respond with illogical offense and not engage in facts as they are, which ends up causing more mental distress and social drift and social division than if we all agreed to operate within complete facts and have conversations that stem from objective reality. It is scientifically relevant to address biological differences between male and female. As God said in Genesis 1:21, He made us in His image and His likeness. In male and female, He made us. And Jesus reiterates this in Matthew 19:4 when He is talking about the authority of God and notes that male and female, He made them. It is by these scientific and theological truths that we come to understand not only what it is to be human, but also that that person has intrinsic dignity, and that acknowledging their differences, both their strengths and their weaknesses in those biological differences between male and female, is actually an effort in empathy to best serve and understand the unique needs of the female and the male mind, body, body and soul. All of these are tools to better understand and serve each individual person, rather than an attempt to erase anyone who behaves outside of these normal definitions. People who want to operate in facts do so out of care and love for the whole person, not to shame or diminish them. So let's hear Dawkins' further thoughts on that here.
And I actually was just thinking about this this last week, and I'm curious what you feel some of the larger implications might be for science. These sort of culture wars, given that all of scientific study separates people by sex. You have your male and your female studies being done. It's very important to do so. What happens when all of a sudden, we're sort of denying that fact?
Yes, well, sex throughout the animal and plant kingdoms is defined by gamete size. Sperms are tiny compared with eggs, and that defines the sexes all over the animal kingdom. And we understand why that is, we understand how that came about, we understand the universality of it. That is the universal biological definition of sex differences. The way sex is determined in various animals is very different. In mammals, it's the XXXY system. In birds, it's a similar system, but the other way around. As you know, in mammals, it's the XY that's the male. In birds, it's the equivalent of the XY that's the female. In many reptiles, it's done by temperature. In some fish, it's done by dominance hierarchy. So there are lots of different ways in which sex is determined in embryology. But sex is defined by gamete size. And that's a universal biological definition. There are no exceptions to that.
Of course, I find these responses interesting and intriguing in a standalone sense. But what I find most interesting is that this staunch atheist who claims to base all of his ideas and conclusions solely in science agrees entirely with this Christian stance as well when it comes to gender and when it comes to biological sex. Noting even that some of those other thoughts or other conclusions do come from a place of mental unease with oneself or one's situation. That is not something to be shamed or hated on, but rather something to be understood. One thing that I've always respected about Dawkins is for all of his snippetyness and all of his bias, he does seem to have a compassion for people on a certain level, and part of his desire to pursue truth so purely as he claims is born out of that compassion. Although he does have a very heavy bias towards people of faith, that doesn't mean that not anything that he says has accuracy or truth or value, of course. I think when it comes right down to it, the desire to speak what is objectively true just should not be controversial. And that is something that I think Mr. Dawkins and I can heartily agree on. As always, I hope this video served you. I'm glad that you're here. I hope that you watched it to the end. Definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments, whether you agree with Mr. Dawkins or whether you have an entirely different perspective on the whole matter. Please just understand that this is a topic that discusses people and people have dignity. So let's respond with kindness in the comments. If you liked this content, I would love it so much if you would consider subscribing. And you might want to check out this video too. Until next time, God loves you and I do too.